Okay, guys, welcome to the Daily Believers Podcast, episode 6.
Mm-hmm.
Here with everybody again, all three of us, Lyndon Shank, Brandon Stewart, and myself, Johanan Mills. And the topic for today is kind of our thoughts and goals on raising a family in this day and age. And the inspiration for this was the fact that I'm actually expecting my first kid here soon. It's not news to you guys, but probably everybody else. And Brandon, you just had a boy a little bit ago. Shank, you're not quite there yet, but we'll see.
Soon. We want to start that process.
You want to pursue that avenue.
I was gonna say, heck of a way to announce it, though. Otherwise, if you have news.
Anyway, so I've been obviously thinking a lot more on, I guess, the challenges of raising a family in this day and age, especially a good godly family. And there's clear differences of godly family structure versus a worldly family structure, or even the fact that in this day and age, it seems like the world in general, but especially our government, really wants to destroy the family structure. And the family is a God-given ordinance, just marriage, husband and wife, is so much it's a God-ordained thing, and it also mirrors the relationship of Christ and the church.
Mm-hmm.
And when that works as it should, it's extremely effective. There's a reason why what the Bible teaches is effective, I guess is what I'm saying. And there's a reason why some families fall apart when you removed God out of that situation, because we all know people that can be successful in a marriage or successful in a family and not be a professing Christian. What you'll see is that some of the values they hold are still Christian values for a reason. And we see that even in larger scale. I mentioned government, even how some governments, even ours, started years ago. There was a lot more Christian values upheld, and when those become deconstructed, you lose a lot of the foundation with which you need to interpret things through and operate from. And when you do that, it completely falls apart. So I know I'm going a little off topic, but essentially we see this so clearly in a family structure and how necessary it is to have a family that has God central, but is also structured as scriptures teach us to structure a family. And so we just want to get into that and talk a little bit about what that means to us. And to be clear, we're not a bunch of graybeards sitting here, excuse me, having raised a family. Well,
I spotted it.
You need a few more to qualify. We're not.
You haven't fought the Balrog yet, so you haven't.
Yeah, you're not Gandalf the White.
That's right. You're Lyndon the Gray.
Yes.
Yes.
But we're not older men that have walked through that experience and are out the other side and have the wisdom to speak on. This is us exploring the topic because it's something that's very pertinent to us right now. Because we have, I was gonna say we have a high potential of raising a family. That sounded really, really weird, but we're at a stage in our lives where, if the Lord will, that's our next step. And so it becomes a much bigger reality than it was several years ago or a few years ago for us. And we talk about it amongst ourselves, and I think a lot about it. And so we kind of decided, well, hey, let's discuss a little bit about this, and hopefully learn from each other. And, maybe you guys will hear something that's at least encouraging. And I'm sure there's things we're going to say that in however many years down the road, we're gonna have to eat our own words, because
laugh at it ourselves
yeah,
a little bit.
This is more speaking from our goals, not speaking from our experience, is what I'm trying to say. Anyway, the first thing I want to cover was family structure, the differences of family structure in a Christian family versus in a family where God is not at all central. What do you guys think are the main differences when it comes down to how a family operates, talking about husband, wife, children, what is the God ordained structure, and what portions of it do we see missing in today's society?
I mean, headship is one thing,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
You have just the father submitting to God, the wife submitting to the husband, and that whole headship structure that society at large completely detests and rebels against would be one of the major things that sticks in my mind as different.
Mm-hmm.
Fathers and husbands as spiritual leaders also. Yeah, you were about to.
No, just going to tag along with that is the world, I think, obviously bristles at that because of redefining what headship is. I think that in their mind it's like this overbearing man makes his wife subservient, and maybe I know there has been men who've done that in the name of God, but I think if we truly look at Christ's example for the church, there should be no time when we do that overbearing, my way or the highway. It's Christ gave up himself for the church, and so that should be our mindset, a very sacrificial, loving, with authority situation. And I think maybe that's sometimes the world's misunderstanding, because they've either seen it done incorrectly, or they just have never understood it correctly in the first place.
Yeah.
Well, I think you make a good point there too, that part of it is not unfounded, what their picture of it is, because when it's perverted, even in the name of God or Christ, it can become very easily a almost tyrannical, legalistic dictatorship, right? But like you said, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and so our authority in our role as head of families is to serve, right? It's a higher degree of service that we're called to.
So that I love how you brought up headship, because headship includes just the leadership role that the husband fulfills. Headship in Scripture is, again, it starts with God, and then Christ under God, man under Christ, woman under man. And when that headship works perfectly as it should, it's a beautiful thing. And when it doesn't, terrible things happen. I actually heard the fall explained this way, and I thought it was really good. And that is, part of the reason why the fall was so terrible is because, I mean, not counting the fact that we sinned against God, obviously, but even in that sin, what was so heinous about it was the fact that the headship structure worked backwards.
Right.
Woman took it upon herself and came to man, deceived man, and man, hid from God and went against God. So it was,
blames the woman.
And blames the woman.
Right.
He's not
So
taking
you have
responsibility.
Exactly.
This
So the
woman,
man didn't take responsibility.
and God. He blames God too.
Yeah.
And this woman that you gave me, right?
Yeah. So that's extremely, extremely important. And you could, I think it's safe to assume that headship even goes down to children under parents, under husband, under wife, then children. So headship is such a good subject, and it really hits on all points, but we primarily focused on the role of headship that a husband has. I think that's great. It has to do with that leadership, but like you said, I think a lot of people would sometimes refer to it as toxic masculinity, but the my way or the highway, like you mentioned.
Yeah. Patriarchy.
Exactly. And we see that as not a proper interpretation of biblical manly headship. It is leadership. It is being strong and making decisions, but it's the whole servant leader, and the role and the role that fulfills, and just even living through example and stuff. So I think that's a very good point. But so talking about family structure, let's carry that on the step. Then you guys covered a little bit of what the responsibilities of the man is. So the next order of the headship would be the woman. In a godly household, what do you think are the characteristics or responsibilities of a godly woman and or, in this case, mother, for having a healthy family unit and raising kids.
Something I haven't thought about as much. I mean, I would say that women in general are, I say in general because there are some women that just it's not their skill set as much, but being able to nurture young children and just be a mom, what that comes to your mind. At least I have, really great mom, so I think of someone who cares for you, who takes care of you, and also teaches you discipline. I mean, your father too, but there's so much things that a mom can instill into a young one that it's often overlooked or not even appreciated as much as, like, it's a huge, if your wife decides to stay at home, which I think is a very good option, there is nothing in my mind less about that than if she has a job. I think she's, if anything, more, that role is so much more important. And I know that's, like, in our society today, that's like, I'm sure people on YouTube will be like, that's terrible, why are you saying such things? But there's so much value in that stability.
Dislike.
Yes, please go ahead and do that if you're in that camp. But I think I wanted to zoom out a little bit, though, on the same topic, though, how this does affect culture. Like, if you try to dismantle this core tenet that God has given us, you see the culture go the same way. I think that's what you were kind of shooting at, and that's I totally agree. I think you look at a culture who, the whole goal is to please myself, to give myself pleasure, and not think about anybody else but myself. At least that's the sense that I get. Is the whole pinnacle of our society would be to be some rapper who can sleep with whoever he wants, have all the kind of cars that he wants, and there's no valuing of that servant leadership mentality. I think that's turning around. You see people like Jordan Peterson and those guys, who, from a secular standpoint, are starting to see the value in responsibility.
But again, it's from
underlying
secular
Christian ethos of the West.
Exactly.
But even in that, so you mentioned from a secular standpoint, but he is hijacking biblical ordinances and truths to put together a structure and offer it as effective. And so again, it comes back to, I'm going to say, the only effective way to have a culture is if it's biblically based. And you can have a unbiblical, even atheistic culture that functions, but probably the reason why it functions is because there are still core traits of a morality that we see as a biblical thing, like a God-given morality, and some of these other structures and tenets, like a family unit, that are essential for society, human society. And if you dismantle, science is another example of this. You can be a secular scientist, but science doesn't make sense outside of a biblical worldview. So either you can, and I know there's scientists that would obviously argue with that and say, well, no, like, we don't believe in a biblical worldview. But the reality is, most of science, especially you go far enough back in history, was originally derived from biblical worldview scientists.
100%.
And those are the people that modern science has built off of. And so you have people nowadays, scientists nowadays, that say, I'm an atheist. We don't need a biblical worldview. Science speaks for itself. But what they don't realize is
that archaic stuff is holding us back. Yeah, it's the reason for all wars, whatever.
Yeah, and what they don't realize is, the science that they studied and the fathers of science that they stood on were the ones that erected the platform of biblical-based science. Right. And that, I know science sounds off topic, but the reality is it all comes back to this, like, a worldview. We're talking about worldview here, and it's
to bring it back to the family. I think when you think of evolution in the sense of origins of man, not iterative design or iterative changes over time, but actual like, there is no design to us as humans, and all our desires are just innate behaviors to further the species. That worldview really distorts what sex is about, why we even have marriage. Because I think
Right.
that scene would say that that sex can be just for whatever purpose, and really is the reason men have sex drives and sleep as many women as they can because they wanted to, further the species.
Mhm.
That's a totally different mindset, and it's a very destructive mindset for a culture, and it really undermines. So I don't know. I guess
Yeah.
I'm struggling to get my words out on that, but that's the concern that I have is it's a naive worldview to think that some of these things that God has ordained is somehow like restrictive. It's like no, he designed us. He knows how we can operate best as a people, as a society, as a
When you
human
think,
race.
sorry, didn't mean to cut into there, but you think about the sort of original Great Commission, so to speak, of
Yeah.
be fruitful and multiply, is pre-fall.
Mhm.
That is the design before man disobeys God and rebels and brings about the curse on humanity.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that gift of multiplication, of reproduction, is given to man and animals. I think in like the first chapter of Genesis, right? Like, thinking about we were talking about the sort of in the headship order role of women, wives, mothers, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I was thinking as we were talking about that, just about I'm gonna struggle to get my thought out here because I thought of several things, but it's not very organized. But thinking about how not downplaying the importance of the role of motherhood, but just thinking about thinking about I think the role as wife still comes first because you're not one flesh with your children, but you are one flesh with your husband, and the sound voice and counsel, because we can only speak as men on this equation, but like just thinking about my own wife, just thinking about what value there is to the sound counsel that she can bring, and all of that still under a spirit of submission, where even if she has a concern about something that's a direction that I'm going in terms of leading, it's still she still tries because it's about her own walk with God, to do so, to bring those concerns to me in a spirit of submission where it's like, make the call, right?
Yeah.
But here's what I think, and here's what my concerns would be. And that's really important because I'm a maniac. So like
It's the concept
I'm
of
bouncing off the walls all the time.
Yeah.
So
I think it's a concept of, as a woman, I really appreciate this because I think my wife does well, is and this means a lot to a man when the woman can present data to you,
yeah,
but still make you understand that they trust you to appropriately deal with that data. And there's some women that I think really, push around their husbands. That sounds pretty harsh, but I'm sure we all have known of at least examples of a family unit or a husband and wife structure that does not work well, and it doesn't work for the wife to wear the pants, as they say. But I tell my wife that she's my best counselor. I tell her that if you're not helping me look at something from different angles and giving me advice and giving me data that I'm either not seeing or not thinking about or avoiding, then who else is going to?
Right.
And it's a beautiful blessing when you have a wife that does that, and also does that in a spirit of not trying to control your decisions,
Right.
but giving you the data and trust. And it means a lot for me when I see my wife, who I mean, she's more intelligent than me, she's more capable than me. You know, I feel like I'm a little stupid, whatever. But she trusts my leading. She trusts my decision making, and I could tell you, not only does that mean the world to me, but you can better believe that I'm going to try even harder to make wise decisions, because I know that she's counting on it as well. And it really it really helps call the husband to step up to the plate.
Right.
And I think that's paramount.
And even further lean on God for guidance, right?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
We've joked before around here about the Holy Spirit through your wife.
Yeah, yeah.
And I see that in my life very often, of like
Me too.
Me being a jerk, not to her per se, but in a situation, and she just gently calls me out and says, like, I don't think that's maybe you can look at that a little differently,
Right.
Or maybe you shouldn't be so judgmental. And yeah, I just
I thought about that.
super appreciate that.
Even bringing up this topic, it hit me that we're sitting here, three men that are probably in a unique situation, in the sense that we both have mothers and wives that we can look up to as just very, very good examples of virtuous women.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very rare in this day and age. And I think we're very blessed, because even some of my friends have not had good home lives, good family lives. And then some of them have even gone on to marry people that maybe aren't what they should be. And I'm not saying that to be hard on them, but the reality is that it's a huge blessing when you can find someone who fits in with the biblical teachings of what you're looking for. Is it Proverbs that says something about like a virtuous woman who can find, or I'm gonna butcher it, but to say it another way, it's really hard to find a good woman in this day and age. And
just to put it out there, men too. It's hard to find a good man, but
yeah, that's true. That is as well. Yes. But
our wives are really lucky.
yeah. So I just felt like I had to say, like, I think we're operating from a standpoint that I don't think everybody operates from, and it's a blessing, because all three of us here would say that we have amazing wives, and that's a wonderful thing, and it's a thing that's, I think, becoming less and less popular as the structure, as the societal structure collapses. People even aren't even marrying anymore. They're just living together. I mean, I know people that are just, well, it's more efficient to date and live together than to be married. Well, right there, you've just destroyed so many biblical ordinances. You don't know where to start. It's, the family structure is very important.
There's sort of an implicit underlying thought process, I think, behind that I don't think is acknowledged, but it's sort of like, I'll live with you until I find someone better, and then I'll move on. I'm not going to commit to you.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
I was talking to somebody about that, and that's what I told him. I said, it's the fear of commitment.
Yeah.
When you can pursue something knowing that you don't go back in your word if it fails. And there's many aspects in life where you see this play out, but one of the larger examples is marriage. People nowadays, if they make vows and then they fail those vows, in some ways, even if they don't care much about the vows that they said, they failed their commitment.
Yeah.
But if you pursue something with no commitment, then anything you do is not wrong, or at least not going back in your word in those people's heads. But it's not a good way to operate.
I've been to plenty of secular wedding ceremonies with family members of mine where literally the vow is like, I'll be with you as long as I'm with you.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it's such like it's got such an escape clause, right? Of just like,
yeah, it's sad.
It's not till death do us part.
Yeah.
Also, a different way of looking at that, just to be aware of is that some people who have grown up in a broken home,
Oh yeah.
they have a lot of PTSD, if you want to say it that way, that they don't want to go down that road. And
Yeah.
I feel so I have a heavy heart for them because they haven't seen the structure that God really wanted, and therefore it has tainted their desire for what God wants in their lives.
Right.
Um, and so it has to be the Holy Spirit to really transform, like He does everyone's mind, to reorient towards what is true and what is authentic, like what God had planned for us. But I had never thought about it too much, and me and Liz were talking about it, and I think we even listened to some YouTube something or other about someone who he just can't even imagine getting married because he's so scared that he's going to do that same thing to his child.
Right.
And that's, at least the person's thinking about some of that stuff, but it just scares them off because they haven't had loving, well, they have loving parents, but they've seen loving parents separate, and what they've gone through is not something they want to repeat. So
Right.
Yeah. And again, it comes back to biblical understanding, biblical principles, because that is where, especially from the man's point of view, that is where we learn how to be a husband, how to be a father.
mm-hmm.
We look at God, we look at Christ and His church, and we see a non-compromising, strong father,
Right.
but also a merciful and compassionate father.
Right.
And you know what better example and king to look to than the real God of the scriptures as we see Him in the Bible.
Well, let me tell you, Johanan, I mean, you have a kid on the way. It will fundamentally change how you think of God as a father, and it'll just it'll open it up to you even more than it was before, of just like, man, what a loving father is God, because that's the thing is, you know, even as you fail, even in trying to best exemplify, you know, godly manhood in your child's life, there's also grace in that you yourself are a child as well. You know, you're yes, you are a a parent and a husband, but you're also a child of God, and there's a lot that you have yet to learn, right? So
yeah. I've thought some about that. I know you're right, because me and my wife had a discussion shortly after we were married on how it really just enhanced our view and grasp of the concept of Christ and His bride.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
It's something that you learn if you grow up in a Christian home. You learn from little on up,
right?
You know, Christ and the church that is His bride, and the relationship, and how the relationship of a husband and wife mirrors that and points to that, which is a beautiful thing. And you can analyze it and look at it, but until you're married and in a good marriage relationship, it'll blow your mind how God has just woven example after example into the marriage relationship, you know, pointing back toward Christ's relationship with his bride, the church.
Because sorry, I was just going to say it, because it's one thing, like you're saying, when you're growing up, if you're in a especially in a Christian home, you know, you read about Christ and the church, and you're sort of like, yeah, like mom and dad, right?
Yeah.
It's another thing when you are married and you're realizing just how selfish you are, you know.
Yes.
And you look at Christ and just think, man, you know.
Yeah.
I cut you off.
I was just going to say, it just reiterates why marriage is so key, not just for societal stability, but it is a type and a shadow of what Christ has designed for the church. I think more appropriately, like, it's reverse of that, in the sense of like the marriage is a reflection of that, as opposed to the church being a reflection of marriage. But yeah, anyways, it's really, I think you're spot on with that. Like, until I was married, had a significant other, I didn't always click as much. Some of those, anyways.
Yeah. That, or you go through a few bad relationships, and then you really get confused with that. We should probably move on to the next question, but I know we belabored that first question or topic a little bit, but some of it was I wanted to kind of purposely zoom out, and I know we talked pretty broadly there for a while, but I think it was necessary. You guys could be so distracting. I think it was necessary to back out and look at it in even a political standpoint or science standpoint or anything like that, because this is not just one area. This area, no matter how much you zoom in or zoom out, you can zoom in down to the individual person and how things that God has ordained and the structure that God has set up is necessary. Or you can zoom out as far as you want to, look at the world in whole and seeing how all creation groans and how broken this world is, and the reason why it's broken is of sin and disobedience from God, and the fall. We're not living in the garden in perfect unity with God. So no matter how much you zoom in or zoom out, we're talking about the same thing. So that was just something I wanted to bring up a little bit. So the next thing I wanted to bring up a little bit, I don't know how much we can really have time to get into this, but church life and direction or decision in churches and church structure when you think of it in the context of raising a family. Me and my wife talk about this because there are churches where I would be okay going to personally before I was married, that after I got married I didn't think would be maybe the best for me and my wife as husband and wife.
Right.
And even more than that, thinking about raising a family, there's a lot more churches that me and my wife as mature adults are willing or enjoy going to that we don't necessarily want to raise our kids in that environment.
Right.
And this can be a big topic. That's why I said I don't know how much time we're going to have to go into this. I remember myself growing up, we visited, many different churches and hopped around here and there. So I had several different church experiences. And as I got older, I came to realize that some of the decisions for maybe moving on to a different church was my parents evaluating the church and the families and the children in that church more specifically,
Right.
and seeing probably what influences we would have as kids if we grew up with those other children, with those families, and they didn't want to see their children grow up with those understandings and those influences constantly influencing them. And it's something that I think is very important to think about, because we are raising the next generation, and all the children you see running around at church are going to be the peers of your kids probably.
Right.
So you want to choose wisely, and that reflects not just on, it's not like you pick the church off of, okay, what kind of children are here,
Yeah.
but that obviously reflects the parenting and the parenting philosophies,
Right.
and the parenting and the way the families operate in some ways reflects the ministry of the church.
Right.
And so it's a very important thing to choose. And there's areas where you as a husband and wife can be okay going somewhere, but it still might not be the ideal place to raise your children. I'm just curious
Right.
where you guys draw those lines, what you look for in a church, thinking about the fact that you're going to raise kids in that church.
I don't know if I've ever thought about it in quite that context, but you're right. Like, there are churches that I have visited that as an adult I can be discerning, like, well, what they're saying there isn't quite how I would explain it, but I can tolerate it because they're good on the essentials. But as a young person sitting under that teaching without that filter,
Yeah.
that is something you want to be really discerning or discriminating on. So that for me, it would be, would I be comfortable with this young one listening to this teaching, and without me after every Sunday service on the drive home from Sunday school deconstructing what was said?
Right.
Yep. That's exactly what I was talking
and
about.
then they also, with that, then have an example of you as a father just relentlessly nitpicking
Yeah.
stuff and ranting and stuff. It's like, well, then, Dad, why are we going here?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
Because I think it is important for the father to set the record straight
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
they see a fallacy. But if you are continually doing that, that's
Mhm.
going to set a pretty poor precedent for your kids when they look to you and see that, daddy's not receiving anything that the church is teaching. So
Mhm.
therefore, I can become comfortable with not receiving any teachings that the church, gives me. And that's a dangerous place to be,
Or-
I think.
Yeah, just setting the precedent of uh, not being under the authority of this is probably a different topic altogether, but just how much are we under the authority of the leadership in our church?
Yeah.
If it's a godly church, I feel like my church, I really have a really appreciation for the leadership there, that I have no issues submitting to their teaching because I have seen their track record of being biblical, being leaders, servant leaders, and that's not an issue. But um, you want to be in a place that you can do that honestly,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and not like I'll be frank. I am a super judgmental person, especially when I visit churches, and my wife's been super helpful and
I was gonna say, let's get your wife on.
pointing that out. And making me realize how critical I am. And it's like, all right, was I going there to learn and hear the word, or was I going there to make myself feel like, oh yeah, they just don't got it together? And so if we're doing that all the time, like you said, that's going to set our kids up to be super critical and super dogmatic about every little nitpicky thing. You're making me think about things I haven't thought about before.
I think
I hope that's a good thing.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's not always a good thing, but no, it's it's.
Sorry, no, I was just gonna say because we recently went through this, my wife and I, in looking for a new church,
Mhm.
and what we were really looking for was the centrality of the gospel, and is this a church that just heralds the sufficiency of Christ? Because there is a sense in which everything else under that is secondary. A sense. It's important. It all is important. But, this almost goes back to the podcast you and me did on youth in church. And
Yeah.
at the end of the day, it's like, what do they need? Do they need youth ministries and, youth programs and, to be able to sing songs in choir or whatever? Or do they need Christ and just need him heralded before them as their only hope for standing before God? Because that's what we need as husbands and fathers. That's what our wife needs. That's what our children need. So, that's I think the central thing, because there can be areas where you disagree with other believers about a whole host of other things, but if that's wrong, right? If the gospel is little more than a tag on at the end for an invitation for the to have a little mini Billy Graham revival at the end of the service, or not present at all, and it's just here's life principles for you, here's whatever, then
I think also the subject of deciding what church to go to for your family ties into this problem that is pretty prevalent, where each generation seems to slightly, in some degree, become more liberal or go to a more liberal church. Not always, and there are many reasons why that is. But one of the reasons that I at least feel like you could or maybe should try to help as a parent is when picking a church, I think people's tendency is to find a church that is comfortable for them, in the sense of maybe a touch on the liberal side for them, but it's not restrictive because of that. And as adults, they can choose to sort through or lay aside the areas where maybe it's a little bit too progressive or liberal or throw in whatever word you want to use there. And it's easy to sort that out, but the kids growing up in that are probably going to more quickly take that as a whole package.
Right.
And then this thing repeats where I think it's less likely for a person to pick a church that is on the conservative end of their beliefs and practices and lifestyle and live within that. But when it comes to raising kids, which is better? Because it's easy to say, well, I'm comfortable at this church. I'm not comfortable with everything that people choose to do at this church. I feel like biblically, I need to have a slightly firmer line in some areas and some convictions, but I enjoy the people and I enjoy this church, and I'm capable as an adult of sorting through. And I don't think that's always wrong, right? But when you raise kids in that society, then you see this generational gap when those kids grow up and you look at the parents and then the kids and you say, what happened? You know, there's a huge change in just even the outward appearance, but more importantly, theology and the choices that you see them making based off of the data that they've grown up with. I think is something that we have to think about.
This is something too that has been, I guess, something of a paradigm shift for me, is just in becoming a dad, especially. My thought process for evaluating certain theological ideas and systems has almost shifted to thinking about it almost more like pastorally, I guess, in the sense of let's take that idea to its logical endpoint, or what are the consequences of and implications of that theological teaching in terms of how will that affect my children's walk with the Lord? How will that affect their assurance? How will that affect whatever? You know what I mean? And sort of just thinking about things in that kind of framework, which I obviously before I was a parent, I didn't, maybe I should have. Take notes, guys. No, I'm just kidding. But I don't know, just I don't know if that even makes sense. Do you see what I'm saying? Like,
yeah,
like almost without even getting into specifics, but just that's more been the mindset that I've had lately.
Well, let's tie into that. Shank, were you going to say something? So yeah, let's tie into that. I don't think we talked a whole lot yet on schooling options. But it's a different topic, but I think there's a lot of crossover when it comes to the decision making.
Right.
Because you're still basing much of your decision making off of the options of influence that you see going here versus there and what decisions you make. So in schooling, you have, probably three main categories. You have public schools. Do you want your kids to be raised by the government? We already touched briefly on how the government has been destroying many biblical ordinances, including family structure, and especially here recently, even simple biology. So can you raise a kid? I know some parents think this. You can raise a kid in a public school, and by the few minutes you talk to them and ask them how their day was going, whatever, you think you can somehow counter the influence of the world. I tend to think not, because that kid, for the majority of their young impressionable life, is growing up surrounded by what people are telling them is fact. And it's very hard for you as a parent, for few odd minutes, hours in the evening, to effectively counter the vast majority of their childhood with the interactions that you have. So then you have a private school option, which was primarily what I did growing up, was a small private Christian school. There's pros and cons to that, or the third option would be a homeschool. And I know that has become, I've been homeschooled. I was homeschooled for a couple years as well, so I'm familiar with that. That's becoming a huge movement, even for non-professing Christians.
Yeah.
Just people that are waking up and realizing that we don't want the government to have our children anymore.
It's a whole different landscape now than it was when my parents were stepping into that whole world,
Yeah.
right? And it's what are you doing? Homeschool, right?
Mhm.
Now
Yeah,
people
yeah.
are, oh yeah, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do you guys think? I mean, what, like, this is something that I struggle because if I make a blanket statement like, well, I would only do this or school
Right.
my kid, like, well, I don't know what the future holds.
Right.
And I may find myself in a different situation where something else might be a more effective decision. But at least, what do you think about the pros and cons of homeschooling versus private school versus public school?
I think for myself, my background is just I went to a private school, Christian private school, all
Yeah.
K through 12. I really enjoyed it. I tend to be a typical middle child who, you know, is very okay with being subject to authority for the most part. Some others in my class did not like the strictness of it.
Yeah.
But as far as children, I can see all three as viable options. If I'm looking at the easiest way to control, I think the homeschool route is a good way to go because you have that complete control over it. I think my goal, if the Lord wills, and I'm a parent, that me and Liz would be able to prepare our children to face the world without introducing that too quickly.
Yeah.
I want my children to be able to, on their own, with a biblical framework, be able to interact with the world.
Right.
Not necessarily being shocked. Like, I feel like my parents did a great job, but I feel like I did grow up very sheltered. And so you get out there in college, and I even went to a local 2-year college. I wasn't even on campus at some big place. And I was kind of surprised that, like, oh,
Right.
people don't believe like I do.
Yeah.
That's
Right.
crazy. And it can really lead to some questioning of your faith. And
that's after you're older and more established in your beliefs.
yeah. And so but then again, I have like friends. Just last night we were out with friends, and we actually had a similar discussion of like, did you do homeschool or what'd you do? And the one guy went through public school, and he said, wasn't always the funnest for me, but it really taught me a lot of how to, I think, how did he put it? Basically, like, understand what you believe, and like he really had to think through some of these things maybe earlier on than I did. So I really think that I would probably lean towards private school and or homeschool if our job situations allow. Another topic I wanted to throw out there, and on the same idea, is like, I grew up in a time when public school, I mean, you guys did too, public school was just normal. But I was recently listening to an audiobook of a guy who wrote back in the 20s. He wasn't even talking about school in general. He was just talking about liberalism versus Christianity. And he just, a little side thing, he was talking about how a court case in Oregon where the government was forcing people to send their kids to public school. And this was a new thing. And he was saying, this is not correct. This is not good. We as Christian parents should be teaching our kids ourselves.
Yeah.
And it was like, whoa. And so this is only 100 years old in this country specifically. And before that, it was very much a thing that the family took care of themselves. And so that kind of makes me feel more on the side of homeschooling, of like, this is, as a father and as a family unit, our responsibility, and we should not hand that over to anybody. Even like the idea of like church ministries for children, that's fine, but if you're not teaching them at home,
Right.
I think we're missing that as well.
And it goes back to the headship primary role of the husband, right, for spiritual instruction, and parents at large, the spiritual instruction for their children. You can't just throw them at the church, right? And kind of
Yeah.
right.
I'm gonna step out on a limb here and say that this is not a prophecy by any stretch of the imagination, but I don't think it is an impossible thing that we'll see, even in our time, the government try to regulate homeschooling because of how downhill things are going. We mentioned that homeschooling is becoming more and more prevalent. And I think that as we see an increase and a rise in the numbers of people that are choosing to homeschool, it's going to appear more and more on the radar of government and organizations.
Yeah.
And I can totally see them trying to then restrict that because they're seeing that they're losing control of the people in general. And
I think you're right.
Germany actually is one country that I know for a fact that you cannot homeschool.
yeah, but it's been that way like forever.
Probably is, but it was just shocking to me. Of
Yeah.
You're telling me I can't teach my child?
Yeah, that's
you know,
the thing.
it's like, what?
And yeah, it's sobering because that's a huge portion of control that a government can just take from you. And what's going to be your
why
response?
governments want that control.
Exactly. And to, I guess, kind of more fully hit a few things you were saying, I completely agree with you. I think I stand in a very similar situation where there are few people who can go through public school and they come out the other side with a greater knowledge and understanding of how the world operates, but can use that for good in the context of connecting and witnessing to those people, but still maintain a strong faith and biblical worldview themselves. I think the risk of that not happening is so high that I'm not willing to gamble that my kids would be one of those. So you're left with the two options of private school and homeschooling. I, at this point, lean very much toward private schooling for several reasons, but the main one is that we do want our kids to be effective in society. And, excuse me, I think that a private school sets them up better to be more effective. Not always, right? But this is on average. And some of these thought processes are birthed out of a discussion I had with one of my friends a few days ago. And he was saying that he thinks it's important that you homeschool because in his mind, when you have a private school and you have a whole crowd of kids that you're teaching, those kids are relating to people their exact same age. And so by osmosis, they're being taught and learning a lot through people their age. And in the rest of society, you have to deal with people much older and much younger than you. And he likes the homeschool position from the point that it teaches a kid to listen to authority and be respectful and all that stuff to parents. Because of that very logic, I actually disagree with him. And the reason is, yes, you might not always react with people exactly your age, but one thing that private schools teach you, or any school really, but private schools primarily, is it teaches you how to appropriately relate to peers. And that's extremely important. And we mentioned about the awkward homeschool child, and that's one thing I've seen it. I've seen it so many times.
Oh, yeah.
Where the child does not know how to function with peers in society, either playing with other kids at like a homeschool convention or co-op, or out relating to people. They're awkward, they're crude, and you get them into a work environment. And this is where I think it is important. A school structure can help, I should say, is because you bring them into a work environment where they have to relate to their work peers. Whether they're the same age or not, they're still peers, and they have to know how to work and relate in that situation, and also answer to the authority of their boss. And I think the system of school really helps set up a comfortability with that kind of process. And add to that, family life should also be teaching that. They should learn how to, if they have siblings, how to relate to their siblings as peers and relate to their parents in respect for their authority. But I really think that it's so important for kids to learn that on a broader scale outside of just their family unit,
right?
That you don't always see in homeschool. But I'm not opposed to homeschooling. I mean,
I think both of you have your focus on the right thing, in that you are preparing your children for adulthood, for being in the world, for not needing you, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's, as you were talking, it just made me think about that too, that it still comes back to the responsibility of men in the family, right? Because, I mean, how often do you see situations where, regardless of this question, like regardless of if you choose the route of homeschooling, private school, public school, I think you can see this in any of those examples, though maybe especially homeschooled, is you have the husband in, neglecting to meet the needs of his wife. His focus is on other things. And so she gets her affection and her fill essentially from the children.
Mm-hmm.
And then she doesn't want to let them go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So now these kids, again, especially in the homeschool world, right, where they're already awkward when they're out there. Now they also have, a mother who doesn't want to let them go. So you have a situation where, like, I don't know, just you see that sort of thing, right? You see the, a spouse or a significant other come into the picture, right? A to-be spouse, and that person just instantly has tension with the parents because the parents don't want to let their kids go,
Mm-hmm.
and so, it's like they're being robbed of their children, but they, and all of it can still come back to the importance then of the husband loving his wife, right? Just following after the example of Christ and loving his bride, right? And the neglect of that has all sorts of implications that you almost can't even think of, right?
I've seen that before. That's a good
Yeah,
point. I know exactly what you're talking about.
I just wanted to throw out there. I think that the homeschool scene has probably understood some of those concerns, and I just think about my nieces and nephews that have grown up in homeschool in the past 20 years. There's a lot of co-op and community kind of things that they do that really has helped with that. I'm not saying it can't still be an issue, but I'm a little biased, but I feel like my nieces and nephews are pretty well-rounded kids, like more than I ever was, as far as like just very disciplined, well thought out kids. And I'm like, how are they? I mean, maybe it's just because I'm getting older and I'm like, these kids are young, but they are. I mean, obviously they have good teaching at home, just in general, but the homeschooling situation just seemed like it has been good for them. So I don't want to throw all the homeschool kids as awkward under the bus or anything, but
no, that's a good point. I mean, I know,
Even though we are a little bit, right?
I know and have met some of your nieces and nephews, and I would agree with that assessment, as well as I know other homeschoolers that are perfectly functional. And Brandon, you're more or less
He's
functional.
pretty
that's-
functional.
I'm functional.
Yeah, you make do. I mean, for that matter, I have homeschooled some, so maybe that is my less functional side. Who knows? But the point is, it is possible to homeschool and not have that. I just think there's dangers, and where I'm at now, and this may change based on circumstance because it so closely has to do with the exact situation you're in and the exact influences that may be coming from either the private school option that you have or the homeschool, and like you mentioned, homeschool co-op option that you have. Because homeschooling is becoming more of a thing and there's more people doing it, there's more homeschool conventions and co-ops and places you can go with your kids that they can get that introduction into learning with other children, relating to other children, which is good. At this point anyway, my thoughts on that are, if I can find a good private school, then that's the better route, because I can predict more the kids showing up at the private school than I can predict who all is going to show up at the homeschool convention. Now, that's that's open to debate, because I know a lot of families and people that would say, well, you can't control what goes on at school either, and you can't, but at least a perfect example is the school that my church has. It's a very small school, and in probably a couple minutes and one or two texts, I could figure out every single family and every single child that's going to that school and probably has gone to that school. And I could do my research and know a little bit what situation and environment my kid's going to be in, right? So even in that, it's almost more controlled than the homeschool and the conventions. Yes, the homeschool's more controlled when the kid's at home, but you take them to these big conventions, and you never know what's, you know.
I was thinking about conversation we were having with Tim at work that speaks directly to this conversation.
Yeah, he does.
And something that he said that really stuck with me was the problem in so many cases is that parents adopt the same indoctrination model that is at public schools, and they just indoctrinate their children themselves with their own things that they want to indoctrinate them with, and the children don't learn how to learn. Right? So
especially the parents went to public school as well.
Right.
Because that's just what they know.
That's what they know.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that this whole question of private school, public school, homeschool, it's something Sarah and I have talked about a lot. I don't know that I have a unilateral answer to. As for what we're probably going to do, we're probably going to at least start off homeschooling to have a solid just base of understanding that, if eventually they were to go to a public school or something like that, it's like, okay, they'd be okay with with the base of instruction that they've had. Something that I see, though, just as I don't know what to do about it, but just a vicious cycle in kind of the whole Christian world is we have such a retreatist mindset all the time, everywhere, that in all of the mainline denominations, we pull out. As soon as there's any kind of theological liberalism or anything coming in, we withdraw and hand it over. Mm-hmm. As soon as, the public schools or whatever start having liberalism or animosity towards Christianity or whatever, we withdraw, we pull out, we go, we start our own private schooling. Then as soon as it happens there, we pull out again and we retreat again and we go and we homeschool, right? And at the end of the day, like, I understand why parents are making those calls, but the end result is a vicious cycle of a secularization of institutions because the Christians are pulling out because of the secularization of institutions.
One thing I would
say, and so the more the Christians pull out, the more it gets worse, and the more the Christians pull out.
One thing I would say to that, and I don't know if could be interpreted as pushback or not, because I agree with what you're saying, especially as adults in church life.
Yeah.
I do split it into two slightly separate categories, though, when we're talking about young children versus adults, because as adults, you're right, I think there's times where we need to be strong Christians and we need to stand up and fight our battles and stand our ground. I think that's, the whole retreatist idea of, I don't like this or this is going south, so I'm just going to go back my long farm lane and hide. It's not okay. Exactly. It's not okay. Yeah. However, we are also called to be protectors and providers for our children, and we don't want to sacrifice our children on the altar of learning what society is like and end up having to give them up to that society at too young of an age. I guess where I'm going with that, or what I'm trying to say with that, is it's important to teach the kids what society is like and what people do think, and teach them how to combat it, because eventually they are going to be adults and they are going to be standing for truth and discussing these things with people and combating it. But we don't want to introduce that at such a young age, when they, instead of understanding it as something that needs fought against, they understand it as something to accept and embrace.
The idea of them and us, it is true that the world thinks differently than us, but I think it can get, if we had that mentality in our home to the extreme that our children almost have this self-righteous attitude.
Yeah.
But I think we're missing the boat, and I can be guilty of that. So I'm not saying this because I've got it all figured out, but I hope that I can teach my kids, like, our neighbors who don't know the Lord, we love them and we want them to know the Lord.
Right.
It's not those evil people over here, and I want them to be able to interact and love people, and to I just think that's something that our cultural Christianity in this country has really polarized so many things in politics and whatever. I mean, just thinking about our elections coming up, I don't even want to think about it, because it's like this dichotomy has been set up as like these liberals are going to destroy this country if we don't elect this particular person. And I want my children to be able to step back and say, the Lord is in control. We can vote if we choose to. I know different people have different views on that, but I want them to step back and say, these people are still humans and they have reasons why they vote that way. Let's try to understand them and actually discuss things, as opposed to like having this black and white. Well, you know me, I'm not a confrontational person, so I much rather discuss things with people, even if I don't agree with them. And I would hope that we can instill that in our children, to differentiate us and them versus, well, they don't know the truth, but that's like something that we can try to help with.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
And to clarify, I am not saying that I am of the us and them mindset, as in we need to be over here and teach our kids that everybody else is on the other side of the fence, and we got to keep the fence there, and we can't get along with them. I think that it's actually really important to teach them how to live in a world full of unregenerate people as a shining light, and draw those people in an inviting way, so that they can be witnessed to, and whatever else it may be. And the point I'm trying to make by this is, an example would be is my neighbors, especially my one neighbor. They're not professing Christians, but we have a great relationship with them. And he's an older guy in his generation. He's a pretty rough dude, ex-military, smoking and drinking, cussing, just very rough. But he's a very friendly man, and we get along great. Especially during the summer when we're both outside more projecting. I'll help him with projects, he'll help me with stuff. I helped him install his pool last summer, and he's helping me work on my lawnmower, and get a hornet's nest out of the tree, and just random stuff like that. And we get along great. And I want my kids to grow up knowing that is a good and that's a healthy thing. You don't run and hide when the scary worldly people come around. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
But if it would be a younger family with young children, the age of, say, if I would have young children, around the same age, I want them to interact with those kids, but I do want them to know that everything those kids come around saying and doing is not okay. And if they're too young, it's very easy to get pulled into stuff. And I know people that have had children get pulled into stuff like that, and I have peers that have got pulled into stuff like that from other influences, where if you're too young and too impressionable, and the neighbor kid comes around saying this, doing this, whatever it might be, it's really easy to be influenced by that. And I think that's the job of the parents, is not to shield them from those people, but to teach them how to process the data they're receiving from those people. It's kind of where I would draw the line. I don't know.
You said something about and really both of you are speaking to this idea of your lost neighbors and loving on them, and it made me think, about that Bible passage that says, where the Lord says, and this is how they will know that you are my disciples, by your pharisaical self-righteousness, right?
Exactly.
No, wait, that's not what he says. He says by your love for one another, right? And thinking about about that, and you said something too earlier where you're talking about not offering up your children on the sacrificial altar of essentially the world, right? And I agree with that. And simultaneously, though, I think we do offer up our children on the sacrificial altar before the Lord in the same way that Abraham did. I mean, maybe not with a dagger drawn at their knife, but in the sense of a recognition at the end of the day of relinquishing of our control, because we ultimately have no claim on them. They are the Lord's, and He gave them, and He entrusted them to us. But I think so much of the problems that we see in all that we're talking about, and just pitfalls of whatever approach you take, a lot of it ultimately comes back to a very human, fleshy need to control, right? And so a lot of the kind of self-righteous legalism and stuff like that you see, how much of that ultimately comes back to, and again, tying it back to our role as men, just a need to try to control everything, try to control everyone in your household and everything like that.
I agree with that thought. I like the whole, you do give up your children to God,
right,
and relinquish, your authority over them. And the other side, this is kind of what I was talking about previously, is like where I agree with that. Kind of what I was more speaking to, I think, was before that time, it's our responsibility to do our part and take responsibility and raise them and
right,
teach them. And I see so many times people falling short from that.
yeah,
And they say, well, it's in God's hands. We need to, we do the best we can, but ultimately the kids can make the choices they decide to make. And it's up to the kid and God what happens. And even if they become a professing believer, we have no control over it. And I in those discussions, I do sometimes push back a little bit, because
you are still responsible.
you are
Right,
responsible.
your
when they're
primary
young.
spiritual instructors, and
Yeah, and you do offer your kids to the Lord, and you do relinquish your authority, and you send them out,
right,
because the whole world is a mission field, right? And you don't want to keep a controlling mindset, but you also don't want to give up. You don't want to shirk your responsibility. And there's a balance somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're all, from what I'm hearing, in agreement with where, at least for now, we're at.
Yeah.
With where that balance is, because both sides are important. You can't just have a vice-like grip on your kids. It doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't just say, be free, and let them go out and go to public school, and don't teach them anything pertaining to a Christian worldview,
right,
and the
right.
gospel.
Yeah.
We need to keep rolling. Second thing I want to talk a little bit about, we'll skip over this pretty fast. Entertainment and media. This all has to do with the influences we were talking about, but where do you draw the line in that? This is something that can tie back to the discussion of churches, where there's sometimes areas where we're okay with something as mature adults that isn't necessarily okay for a younger child. In entertainment and media, music, movies, whatever you're talking about, it's easy to draw a line somewhere because you're okay with and understand what it is and what it's portraying, and you draw a line somewhere. But a very young, impressionable child might be influenced by that in a different way. So where do you draw the line? This is something that me and my wife have talked about, but it's really something we don't have many answers on, because it seems like such a gray area,
Yeah. Yep. That is a difficult question. It's one that we're also wrestling with and working through. It's one of those things too where I think so often our kind of fleshy desire, so to speak, is to just want clear thou shalt not commands in the Bible for everything, when more often than not there are principles for guidance, but you're kind of left in a situation where you have to make the best decision that you can to honor the Lord, and that's going to look different with different people. And there's extremes that you can fall into on either side of legalism on one side, where you're enforcing standards that Scripture never does, and also just a total lawlessness where you're now actually allowing things into your home that you really shouldn't be. I don't know. It's something that we're working through too.
Yeah.
I think about stuff that maybe me and Liz will watch. Maybe it's a reality show, and they'll have people on there who have alternative lifestyles, as the society calls it, like different opinions on sexuality. And I think we can navigate that and realize that we don't agree with that, but that kind of thing normalizes it for a child,
Yeah.
That's where I would start to not struggle, but how do you determine, okay, this is a fine movie, but they have this one character. It's like, how do we go around that? And also it's age appropriateness too. Like, you're not going
Right.
to show them that movie. But other part of me just wants to, like, let's not have a TV at all. And I want my kids just to read. And, I had this like idealistic lie.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
they're going to be super, like, just cultured kids. And I know that's probably not going to be the case. So how do we navigate that in a not too overbearing, legalistic, but then also, like you said, not just whatever happens, because media is so tuned to sway our emotions. Every, I think for the most part, every show, every TV show, or every movie you watch, the director had a goal in mind, and sometimes those goals are certainly a secular pagan kind of mindset that can be instilled in you. I would say though that my wife has helped me see that Christians can do art and culture, like movies, art, like, Brandon's an artist, and they can do it well. And I think that almost in the sense of not retreating, but see, we always, maybe we shouldn't joke about it, but like there's Pure Flix, which is like the Netflix alternative.
Yeah.
Same kind of mindset you're talking about.
Yeah.
Like, okay, we can't do this, but we're going to create our own separate little thing. And usually those movies are pretty terrible. Like the messaging is great, but the quality isn't there. And Liz is like, why can't we as Christians make good movies
Right.
and do it to the best of our ability? And still, it's hard though, because the whole culture of Hollywood is not one of Christianity. So how do you do
We need
that?
more C.S. Lewis's
Yeah.
out there.
Yeah.
I was had a thought, but I just forgot it. So let's
But what were you thinking? Your thought? This is something that, again, I think is really dependent on the age of the kids, because at a different age, younger ages tend to be more impressionable. From what I know, again, no experience here. At least at those ages, you need to be. It's very important to be teaching them, and so obviously, when you come down to, you were speaking on movies, there are some things I don't care what age you are, you shouldn't watch. It's not good. I'm trying to think. Well, okay, by way of example, like bad sexual scenes. I don't believe as Christians we should indulge in and watch that.
Oh yeah.
I think that's wrong. And I don't care what age you are or how mature you are. You can say, I personally know Christians that say, well, we're mature, we're married, so that's okay now. And I don't see that anywhere in my Bible.
Yeah.
There's other things where
I used to think like that, and the Lord really convicted me on it.
Yeah. There's other things where maturity does play a large role into how you view something. You mentioned about world views or concepts, and just messaging in movies, that I can watch a movie and realize that they're maybe pushing this specific narrative, and I can recognize that narrative for what it is, and I know I don't agree with it, and I can set it aside. And the main message of the rest of the movie is okay, and it's a fine watch, and that's fine. A young child, though, you mentioned it, it begins to normalize that for them, and that, I think, is dangerous. And so it comes down to the decision of, do you take everything away? Tell your kids to read books. Do you let them be exposed to everything that you would expose yourself to, and try to just teach them, like, hey, this is what's going on? I don't think there's one answer that you can cover everything. I do think one of the more important things is teaching kids to build convictions themselves at a young age.
Yeah.
I want my child and my children to think for themselves, to know how to build convictions and hold convictions, and know why to make those decisions and convictions. And in some ways, I think the younger you start teaching them that, then the younger they'll be when they're able to handle influences that come, whether it's across the screen or in real life, that are against what they've been taught, because they have the faculties to now process it properly. And if they haven't been taught that, I think it's more dangerous, and maybe things then should be limited more. I don't know.
I was just gonna say it's one of I agree with everything you're saying. It's one of those things also with just have we have an 8-month-old, so we don't have experience with like older kids yet, but just it is one of those things where before you have kids, you have so many opinions about parenting and how you're gonna parent.
Yeah.
That fly out the window, and it's like he's screaming, but Pixar's Cars shuts him up. And it's like okay, so now we're watching so much more TV than we ever planned to, but it's survival. So there's also a level of that where there's so many strong opinions that we can have that I'm sure anyone listening who's got like 12-year-olds, they're like, you guys are cute. You guys are cute.
Mm-hmm.
But
I once thought as you did.
But also, it's good to form ideals.
It is. Yeah.
Some parents
It's good
say,
to think about this now.
Yeah.
Before. Yeah.
Understanding that you are going to have to compromise and that reality is going to hit.
Yeah.
And accept that, right?
Yeah.
We're expecting, but I have no experience yet. So stuff's gonna hit the fan.
Oh yeah, they're gonna hand you a baby, and you'll just be like
terrified,
and you're like, I never changed a diaper before, but here we go.
I don't know how to do parent.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah.
But
and they just let you walk out of the hospital with it. It's not like it's not like PetSmart where they're like, so how's your cat doing? It's like it's just like you're all right.
Be free.
Enjoy.
Yeah. But
good luck.
There's people and parents that kind of take the other standpoint, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they say, well, everything's going to go to pot. So what's the use? Like everything I say or purpose to do, when rubber hits the road, it's not going to happen. It's going to be so different than what I expect. So they don't make goals. And I think that's really not a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, just from a practical standpoint, I have, I really look up to my brother and his wife. They have 6 kids. They've homeschooled them, so they've made that choice. But as far as media is concerned, they were pretty controlling on as a family. They would watch things together, so they could,
This is Brendan.
Brendan, yeah.
Okay.
But what I appreciate, and I'm guessing my sister probably has done the same thing. But each kid, they made a decision at 13 that the child was going to get an iPad, but we have screen time, so maybe an hour each evening. You decide, to a certain extent, if you're going to game or whatever, that's it, you're going to put it away. And it's like a slow integration into like, we're going to give you some responsibility. We're going to monitor that. But that's, and I know that's not a one size fit all, but I really appreciated that mindset of like, we're not going to shelter them completely, but we're also going to gradually, as you get into the teenage years, I'm pretty sure it was like 10 or 12 or something like that, we're going to allow you to have this device, but we're going to actually take that device from you when you're done with it so that you just don't have free reign. And at some point, when they get older, then they can just have it. But
essentially, we're going to moderate for you until you are old enough
until you
to understand that you need to
yourself, proven that you can handle this responsibility. So anyways, just want to throw it out there that I really appreciated that.
Sort of like you may eat of any tree in this garden, but
exactly.
But if you do this, you will surely die, right?
Yeah. So, well, we gotta close here real soon. I think we're going over time again. That's normal for us. I don't even really know what's overtime anymore because we set goals before we start the podcast.
Everyone watching is like, what do you mean? Like last one was 2 hours.
Yeah. Integration into adult life is the last thing I wanted to cover, but we've been covering that almost every point so far.
Mm-hmm.
So by way of closing, any things to take away from this? There's a few things that kept coming up in each discussion that I think are very important. One of them being just teaching a child to think for themselves and not sheltering them from everything that you deem as of the world or from the outside. Because if you completely shelter or shield a kid from every kind of influence they might deal with, I don't think they're going to be as effective in this society. But you also have to teach them how to distinguish between influences of the world and biblical truth and understanding. But yeah, do you guys have any thoughts on just final kid integration?
I guess the only thing that I was just thinking as a through line to all of this is, you know, fundamentally, is your goal for your children to know Christ, or is it something else?
Yeah.
Right. Because I think that can be an issue with all. It's one of the reasons I don't have a clear answer on homeschool, public school, private school. I've seen people make any one of those options work. I've also seen almost, the gospel becoming obscured in certain contexts where it almost becomes more of an emphasis on like the fundamental identifier of what is it that makes you a Christian is, well, we homeschool.
Yeah.
Well, we do whatever. It's something secondary, and that's,
You
I
stand
think,
up to
really
give your
dangerous.
testimony as, well, 5 years ago I found homeschooling.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, you've listened to that sermon too,
I
right?
did.
Yeah.
That's great.
But it's something that I've seen also, and the focus can get taken off of Christ and put on something else,
Yeah.
and I think that's the through line to all of this is, our responsibility as husbands and fathers is directly in relation to how much are we modeling Christ in our marriages and as parents, regardless of these other questions of whether you choose to homeschool or private school or whatever. That's, I think, the through line to all of it.
No, that's very good. Well, we should close down. So that concludes episode 6, I think it is.
Yep.
Anyway, so thanks to everybody who endured the full length of this, and we'll see you guys next podcast.